I suppose I can be charitable to the other presenters because I have no idea where I'm going to contradict them. I'm grateful for the invitation to speak here. The standard line of argument is that by the time Joseph Smith ran across Egyptian papyri, Jean-François Champollion had already deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs. Joseph Smith should have known better, but clearly didn't. In this case, it's not that people think that Joseph Smith knew anything about the ancient world, but they think that he should have. And whoever would place Joseph Smith in the Egyptology in his day has two hurdles to overcome. The first is knowing what Egyptology was actually like in Joseph Smith's day. The second is figuring out what we can know of Joseph Smith's involvement in Egyptology. And I'm going to abbreviate my comments a bit, and it pains me, but we tend to forget that what Egyptology was actually like in Joseph Smith's day. The following was a viewpoint from a bit closer to that time. Quote, "The theories of Spone, Klaproth, Julianoff, Riccardi, Gianelli, and others are forgotten," said the Reverend Peter Lepage Renouf in 1859, or at least have ceased to occupy the attention of those who seriously intend to make themselves acquainted with the language, the literature, or the history of Egypt. One of those mentioned, Klaproth, stated in 1827, "Monsieur Champollion does not like anyone to speak about Egypt without his permission. And above all, he does not like anyone to mention those who are engaged in it before him. It is an unpardonable offense." This is an indication of the disagreements among the various scholars vying for the title of decipherer of hieroglyphs. It is an indication that Champollion had not yet carried the day. Egyptology was not the settled field it is now, or was even by the end of the 19th century. And unfortunately, I have to skip my beloved Demotic here, because they could actually read that. The received wisdom is that Jean-François Champollion published his decipherment of the hieroglyphs on the Rosetta Stone in French in 1822, and this is somewhat misleading. What Champollion established in 1822 was a correspondence between the letters of the Greek alphabet and several hieroglyphs found in the Greco-Roman period cartouches, and that these letters corresponded with the first sound of the Coptic words for the pictures composing the hieroglyphs. And this was an important first step, but is only a first step. In 1824, Champollion extended his decipherment in a two-volume work called the Précis. And I won't bore you with the details, but Champollion's 1824 Précis was the true decipherment, and a second edition containing many corrections was issued in 1828. After Champollion died in 1832, 3 years after Young, who deciphered Demotic, Champollion's brother, Jacques-Joseph Champollion-Figeac, edited and published his grammar and dictionary posthumously over a period of 1836 to 1844, and by his bungling editing prevented the decipherment from being acknowledged for years. Richard Lepsius examined Champollion's work thoroughly in 1837 and pronounced it sound, doubtlessly because it was too early for the editorial gaffes of Champollion-Figeac to have tarnished the work unduly. The hieroglyphic dictionary into English, the work of Samuel Sharp, appeared in 1837. Sharp reviewed the decipherment and based his vocabulary on the Rosetta Stone and a few stelae in the British Museum. Sharp's work serves as an amazing illustration of how badly wrong someone can be in matching up the translation with the original text. Sharp divides the words in the wrong places and associates the words of the translation with the wrong glyphs. Now, Sharp was not stupid, but he was often wrong. And Sharp also has lengthy explanatory notes about his translations in the dictionary, yielding lengthy definitions that sometimes go on for pages. Gustav Seyfarth, a superb copyist of Egyptian documents, studied Semitic languages under F.A.W. Spone. You may have heard his name before. Seyfarth's life is perhaps the most tragic example in all Egyptology of a brilliant mind, perhaps genius, led astray by fantastic notions. Had he used his very great intellectual powers alongside Champollion, Lepsius, Brugsch, and Ebers, whom he fought for 60 years, his contributions to Egyptology might have been immense. He had a keen eye for detail and could reproduce a hieratic text as well as any ancient Egyptian scribe. Furthermore, he was skilled in transcribing hieratic into hieroglyphs, and these skills served him well. From 1826 to 1828, he wandered through Europe collecting inscriptions, the 14 volumes of which serve as the basis for his understanding of Egyptian. In 1855, he published another grammar of Egyptian, arranging the signs by objects represented. Seyfarth's grammar, which was based on Coptic, is not bad, but his interpretation of signs is atrocious. Seyfarth respected Young's work, but denied Champollion's any validity, perhaps because he misunderstood Champollion's argument. In 1860, Seyfarth could pronounce that those who had failed at translation did so, quote, probably because they were acquainted only with the system of Champollion, according to which nobody as yet has succeeded in translating one line of hieroglyphic or hieratic text down to this day, as is known. Though much of Seyfarth's work is simply wrong, in Seyfarth's defense, it must be said that he interpreted many things correctly. The problem is discerning which is which, a task that is far easier with 150 years of hindsight. Seyfarth vociferously and ferociously attacked anyone who disagreed with him. When Reverend Peter Lepage Renouf pointed out that his system made no sense, he said, quote, I must acknowledge that the said article is written so ingeniously, skillfully, and winningly that scarcely one reader, except the author and myself, would suspect its deceptiveness, and that, had I not a conscience, I should wish to be able to write such articles. On the other hand, I cannot conceal that his treatise is so full of contradictions, misrepresentations, insinuations, and calumnies on every page that a small volume would not suffice to refute them all. Replied Lepage Renouf, I will not return Dr. Seyfarth's compliment. I'm convinced that he is utterly incapable of anything like willful misrepresentation or deliberate calumny. But it is not to any moral perversity that we must attribute the incredible misrepresentations of facts so common in Dr. Seyfarth's attack on all of Egyptologists since the time of Champollion, but to a peculiar inaccuracy of mind, in consequence of which he misses the exact meaning of the author and hits upon something essentially different, though more or less resembling it in sound and sense. Even when he quotes the very words of an author, we cannot be sure that we have the author's meaning, since Seyfarth would misquote or misattribute quotations. Seyfarth's complaint that Champollion could not provide a translation for the Rosetta Stone or anything else was accurate. Just after Seyfarth left Europe, however, Olivier Charles Camille Emmanuel de Roger had been the first to translate a running Egyptian text, laying out the correct ground rules for reading and translating hieroglyphic text. In 1851, Heinrich Brugsch published his examination of 2 hieratic documents of breathings made by Isis, the first extensive examination and translation of a hieratic text. Note, these are after Joseph Smith's death by a number of years. Now, most of the events pertaining to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs took place in Europe and are not reflected in America. The barrier of the Atlantic insulated America somewhat from the progress in the decipherment. What was available in America is more pertinent to what Joseph Smith might have known. News of Champollion's discovery was published in Boston in 1830 by Moses Stuart and his son Isaac. The Stuarts translated a French evaluation by J.G.H. Grapeau, who spent most of his book discussing how this might prove advantageous for biblical studies, and provided a brief alphabet of 12 hieroglyphs with their correct hieratic and demotic equivalents. 12 years later, the Stuarts' translation was republished in New York, but without the plates, so that in effect, no key for decipherment was given. Neither one of these books ever made it to the Manchester, New York Public Library, which contained nothing on the subject of ancient Egypt whatsoever. They were also published after the Book of Mormon. The first popularization of Champollion's discovery to reach America was George Gliddon's Ancient Egypt, which was published in 1843 and sold 24,000 copies. This is the year after the Book of Abraham was published. Gliddon went on an extensive lecture circuit promoting Champollion's decipherment and his own book. No Egyptologist arrived in America until Gustave Seyfarth arrived in 1854, and he was definitely out of the emerging mainstream. In fact, it was because he was out of the emerging mainstream and found it increasingly hard to get his numerous and extraordinary works published or to found a proper school that he emigrated to the United States. Thus, in John Wilson's opinion, in 1864, there was no American to match the scholars of France, Germany, and Great Britain in Egyptology. The first American to be professionally trained in Egyptology was Charles Edwin Wilbur, who studied under Maspero beginning in 1880. Wilbur, however, was in exile for his involvement with the infamous Tweed Gang and never returned to America. Thus, Wilbur's training came too late and never made it across the Atlantic. The first American to get a PhD in Egyptology was James Henry Breasted. Breasted received his undergraduate degree from the Chicago College of Pharmacy in 1886, a master's degree from Yale University in 1891, and a PhD under Adolf Ehrman in Berlin in 1894. In 1895, he began teaching Egyptology at the University of Chicago. Breasted noted that in 1912, American universities have never until recently given such studies any attention, and there is still only one professorship of the science in the United States, his own, established in the University of Chicago in 1905. So what was the Egyptology available for examining the Joseph Smith papyri in Joseph Smith's day? If the papyrus had been written in Demotic and available in Europe, there would have been hope for an accurate analysis. As for hieroglyphs, Champollion had published the basics of the system, but it required a knowledge of Coptic derived from other sources and was not universally accepted in his day. Champollion-Figac's grammar was nearly impossible to work with, just try it. De Roget's work was as yet unpublished. Hieratic was recognized, but no extensive work had been done on it. The Book of the Dead was not recognized, and any work done on it would have been essentially from scratch. Lepsius published his edition of the Book of the Dead the same year that the Book of Abraham was published. The Book of Breathings had been published in facsimile form, but had not been translated, and so any work on the subject would have been from scratch. Although news of the results of Champollion's work had reached America, it was only available in poorly reported, badly published, filtered versions of his early work. When Joseph Smith worked with the papyri, it was essentially on his own, without any benefit of bilingual inscriptions or Egyptological work of any kind. The father of American Egyptology, James Henry Breasted, was in a unique position to recognize the state of Egyptology previous to his day, and wrote in 1912 that in Joseph Smith's day, it would have been as impossible for any American scholars to know about Egyptian inscriptions to read them. It will be seen then, Breasted concludes, that if Joseph Smith could read ancient Egyptian writing, his ability to do so had no connection with the decipherments of hieroglyphics by European scholars. So the other half of the equation is how to figure out what Joseph Smith knew of Egyptian. Now, while we could and probably should consider the contributions of others of the early brethren, Oliver Cowdery was, after all, the first in modern times to correctly identify Book of the Dead 125 vignette as a judgment of the dead, beating out Richard Lepsius by 7 years and Max Ullmann by almost 20. But how is one to know what Joseph Smith knew of Egyptian? Well, let's start with the facsimiles. Everyone assumes that Joseph Smith wrote the explanations to the facsimiles from the Book of Abraham. We cannot, however, prove that he did. The earliest manuscripts of any of the explanations are Book of Abraham manuscripts 5a and 6, both in the handwriting of Willard Richards. There is nothing in the documents that indicates authorships. While I'm not saying that assuming that Joseph Smith wrote the explanations is a bad assumption, it does need to be pointed out that it is an assumption. It is not provable. If someone wanted to argue that Willard Richards wrote the explanations, we could not prove it false. So one cannot with certainty use the explanations of the facsimiles as a source for Joseph Smith's knowledge of Egyptian or lack thereof. Now, it has been popular to use a group of documents, often called the Kirtland Egyptian Papers, to reconstruct Joseph Smith's knowledge of Egyptian. And there are three problems with this approach: provenance, format, and the journal entries. And before we proceed with an examination of the documents of this group, it is worth remembering that each of the documents has its own reason for existence, its own subsequent history. Just because the documents are lumped together now does not mean that they were lumped together then or that they should be lumped together. Different criteria applied to the documents create a surprisingly different grouping of documents. One of those groupings comes if we look at the provenance of the documents. All of them are now in the church historian's office, but not all of them took the same path to get there. The different routes show that they come from different 19th century archives. Those archives, in turn, tell us something important about the documents. The vast majority of the documents were brought to Utah by Willard Richards and W.W. Phelps, but one of the documents, manuscript 1291 folder 1, was given to the church by Wilford Woodruff in the 20th century. He had obtained it from the Biddemans, who had gotten it, Charles Bideman, who had gotten it from his father as Louis Bideman, Emma Smith's second husband. So this document, manuscript 1295 folder 1, we know belonged to Joseph Smith. The others, then, did not. To whom did they belong? Well, they arrived at the church historian's office through Willard Richards and W.W. Phelps. 4 of the documents, manuscript 1295 folders 4 and 5, and that is 4 documents, but 2 folders, are in the handwriting of Willard Richards and can be safely said to belong to him. Most of the rest of the documents are in Phelps's handwriting and seem to have belonged to him. Thus, we have 3 archives that have been combined into a heterogeneous dossier. As William Scriver has pointed out, the format of the Kirtland Egyptian papers follows that established by W.W. Phelps in work he did on the pure language in May 1835 before anyone in the church had heard of the papyri. So you see his 1835 work on, the May 1835 work on your left, and an example from the Kirtland Egyptian paper following the same format on the right. So he did this work before anyone had heard of the papyri, and all of them are from his collection of manuscripts. So the Kirtland Egyptian papers, as a whole generally, show the influence of his thinking and were begun in his handwriting. They show what W.W. Phelps thought. And this includes the famous Grammar and Alphabet book, the L is missing, which was wrongly included last week on the Joseph Smith Papers website. Contrary to the recent publication on the website, the book cannot date to 1835. Well, how do we know that? The system of transliteration that Phelps used in the book follows the transliteration system taught by Josiah Sedgwick beginning in January of 1836. So here we have on the left a document dated to the 1st of October, 1835, and the one from the alphabet, or Grammar and Alphabet on the right. And you notice that the same words are there, a little bit blurry, and they have an H on the end to close the system. See, words in Sedgwick's transliteration, words with the short final vowels end in an H. And the transliteration system used before that does not have the H. And this can be seen in transcriptions made on the left. Since the book has the later system, it must date after the later system was taught. And as we've heard, Phelps was one of the ones in the Hebrew school, and thus must date to after its introduction in January of 1836. Joseph Smith's journal indicates that within a week of receiving the Hebrew and Greek books on the 20th of November, 1835, he dropped Egyptian in favor of Hebrew. So within a week, there's no more mention of any work on Egyptian, and isn't until 1842. So Joseph Smith is not involved in this work in 1835 or 1836. Joseph Smith's journal also seems to indicate that the documents in Phelps's archive belong to Phelps. After Joseph Smith heard W.W. Phelps read a letter that Joseph Smith had him write for that quotes from the documents in 1843, Joseph Smith called again and inquired for the Egyptian grammar, according to his journal. Yet 2 days later, he, quote, suggested the idea of preparing a grammar of the Egyptian language, apparently because he did not agree with Phelps's treatment. Thus, the provenance, the format, and Joseph Smith's treatment in his journals indicate that the majority of the Kirtland Egyptian papers belong to Phelps. So they cannot be used to reconstruct Joseph Smith's knowledge of Egyptians, only that of W.W. Phelps. So the only certain source of Joseph Smith on Egyptian is the text of the Book of Abraham, excluding the facsimiles. Now, the text of the Book of Abraham actually shows clear information about its antiquity. There will be some coming up in a new issue on the Journal of Book of Mormon and other restoration scriptures. And I will show one Egyptianism from the Book of Abraham manuscripts. This is from the earliest, this is manuscript 2, but it's the earliest manuscript we have of this passage. You can see starting on the second line there, where it says, their hearts were turned, that's been crossed out, and then is written, they have turned their hearts, which is the standard reading now in the Book of Abraham. Now, in Egyptian, of the time period of the papyri, unlike Hebrew or Greek or Latin or Aramaic or Syriac or the other languages spoken at that time, Egyptian makes a passive that earlier had a distinct passive form, but that drops out about 1200 BC. They make a passive by using the third person plural in the active tense. So you cannot tell the difference in Egyptian between they turned their hearts and their hearts were turned. It will read exactly the same. We may have here an indication of an alternate translation. And if you look in the document, the previous time, place where a construction like this had occurred, it had been rendered into the passive. And so you may have an instance of Joseph Smith changing his mind about how to interpret the text in a way that only matches Egyptian at that time. Now, since Joseph Smith and the brethren worked independently of the Egyptological tradition in Europe, it comes as no surprise, first, that the work produced does not use the same or even similar terminology, and this is a hang-up for some people. Second, that the transliteration system employed bears no particular relationship to the various transliteration systems of Egyptology, either of the 19th or the 20th century. And third, that Joseph Smith is not accepted as belonging to or part of the Egyptological tradition of the last century. So the critic's breathless conclusion that such is the case requires no special insight. The net result of this investigation is that we have few resources to determine what, if anything, Joseph Smith understood of Egyptian. Egyptian was not really understood in Joseph Smith's day. Not a single inscription in either hieratic or hieroglyphs had been completely translated before his death, and none were published until at least 7 years afterwards. Joseph Smith was not in the tradition of Champollion to which Egyptology today belongs. Any knowledge he may have had did not come from that source, and indeed, everyone is in agreement about that. Thank you.